Grom the Paunch, the greatest and largest, literally the largest goblin to have ever existed in the Warhammer world. So ginormous was his girth that he could bully orcs around. And were the ogres invented at the time that GW ripped his enormousness off from the great goblin of Lord of the Rings fame, the ogres would undoubtedly have named him Honorary Ogre. For even amongst their corpulent kind, Grom would have ranked near the top in sheer, undiluted fatness. But first, a word from our sponsor, the groundbreaking PC and mobile hero strategy game Raid Shadow Legends. With over 600 champions from varied and unique factions, it is the premier mobile game. And today we are having a look at the backstory of one of those factions, the Elves. Amongst the oldest races in the world, their homeland, Aravia, has been around for thousands of years. They even taught humanity all they could about civilization, but clearly even the elves had something to learn themselves, as the evil influence of Xeroth snuck into their golden kingdom, turning many of their kind to darkness. Recrimination and chaos followed as the race began to splinter and was thrust into a brutal civil war which threatened to destroy Aravia and all else. But peace eventually returned, and Aravia was rebuilt, grander and greater than ever, as a bastion of civilization for all the races. And it remains a shining beacon to this very day. But what is happening in the game, you might wonder. This month, 5 new champions enter the fray along with an overhaul to the Champions Vault, giving easier storage and access to Heroes Plus, the Summer Splash event, where you can earn the new Trunda Gilt Mallet skin. So, you should jump in too. You can use my QR code on screen right now or link in the description below. And as a new player, you get almost $30 worth of free bonuses and the champion I know. You'll find all of these rewards in your inbox right up here when you enter the game. But how was this majestic mass attained? What is the origin story for his culinary crusade, which would grow to be the single largest waaagh ever launched by any greenskin, even orcs, eclipsing both that of Gorbads and Grimgor? Well, suitably, it all began with a meal. Around the year 2400 in the imperial calendar, little Grom was a boss of little import in the Broken Axe tribe. He was one of many such sub-lieutenants and officers raised to prominence by the local big boss. The only thing that made Grom any different from all the others was his penchants for eating. Now, goblins, by and large, are hardly picky eaters and will usually scarf down anything and everything they come across, but most will at least deign to attempt to cook it before devouring it. Grom, however, he struggled a bit with impatience as well, and on one particular evening, his tribe had managed to bring down a troll. Now, trolls are tremendously good eating when properly prepared, but Grom, again struggling with his impatience, decided to gobble down a big piece of troll meat before cooking it. This is usually a death sentence for anyone who tries, because trolls regenerate continuously, and even troll meat, when sliced into tiny portions, will also continue to regenerate for a long period of time. And the choice slice that Grom had decided to swallow whole must have been a particularly potent variant, as even years and years later, it was apparently still providing him with nourishment. Sounds like a bit of a cheaty way to survive in the Badlands, really. Infinite food, but, well, again, here's the thing. Leave the troll meat alone for long enough and it will either stop growing, or if you treat it, salt it, roast it, etc., it will also stop growing. And if you leave it alone for too long, and it is of this kind of virulent type, it might very well regrow the troll, which could be a bit of an issue in the long run. And obviously, if you eat it without treating it, it is now a constantly growing hunk of meat inside of your stomach, struggling consistently to turn your insides into your outsides. And that was precisely what happened with Grom as well, as he suffered enormously for days as the piece of troll meat did its level best to burst out of his stomach. Any other goblin would have split apart like an overripe tomato, much to the amusement of his fellow greenskins standing around, no doubt preparing to point and laugh. But Grom was clearly an extraordinarily gifted bon vivant, and remained unripped all throughout the long day, until finally his stomach acid gained the upper hand on the troll meat and prevented it from, at least directly, threatening the poor little goblin's life. Though little is no longer the correct term, as already on the first day, Grom had grown much larger than the big boss of the Broken Axe tribe, to the point that he swiftly replaced him. We do not know exactly what happened to the previous leader of the Broken Axe tribe, but, well, goblin leaders rarely survive a regime change. Nor did the previous big boss's chair survive it either, as the new big boss was an impressive one indeed, and still growing. Nowhere near as obviously anymore as when he'd imbibed the troll meat, but still it was impossible to notice that the goblin had grown far beyond the proportions of any other goblin ever known, and was still widening. And as strength, and in this case weight, is power in goblin society, Grom found himself unmatched in authority. He quickly began moving the Broken Axe tribe towards the Badlands and the southern edges of the World Edge Mountains, leaving behind the misty mountains that was his birthplace. For several years, the tribe continued raiding the area and picking up various other tribes of goblin wolf riders. It was from amongst these tribes that Grom also gained his favored mode of transportation, a huge special-built chariot. No doubt Grom had tried to get on top of a wolf, like so many aspiring big bosses have. Most of them have the issue that the wolf will throw them from their backs and then messily eat them. Grom did not have that problem, as no wolf could ever throw him off its back. The bigger issue was that the moment Grom actually sat down, the poor creature's spine would snap like a rotten twig. He must have went through a considerable number of the beasts before, presumably looking for a way to preserve their stable. The local goblins offered up to him the special-built chariot, which had to be pulled by no less than 3 specially bred alpha wolves of tremendous size. It was also presumably somewhere out in the Badlands that Grom came across his axe. Though axe is a charitable interpretation for what is essentially a ginormous hunk of semi-sharpened metal on a stick. But axe, nevertheless, we shall call it. Elf Biter. The name was gained mainly during Grom's much later on invasion of Ulthuan, but we know for sure that he was in possession of it a lot earlier, as after many years of scouring the Badlands, Grom set out for his greatest challenge to date, which was to take over a nearby dominant orc tribe. Now at this point, Grom had gained quite the reputation, and had attracted hordes of goblins from both near and afar, as they came to see his magnificence. But despite being idolized by the goblins, or perhaps because of it, no orc would ever deign to serve beneath a lowly goblin. This is a truism that has only been challenged a couple of times throughout the entirety of green-skinned history, and knowing that his strength could only grow so far purely off the backs of fellow little goblins, Grom knew he had to make himself known even amongst his larger cousins. But how to do this? The nearby Gutstabber tribe was much, much more powerful than Grom's warband. He was, at the end of the day, for all his stature, a borders goblin warlord, leading raiders against trade routes and outlying dwarven outposts. He was not a power to be reckoned with. The very least not yet, and in a straight-up confrontation, his army of goblins was likely to come up woefully short when faced with Gutstabbers orcs. And so, realizing this either through intelligence, cunning, or sheer hubris, Grom decided on a rather unorthodox and very ungoblinoid approach. He simply started walking. Axe carried along with him, he trudged up into the mountains where Gutstabber's camp was to be found. Of course, the obese goblin's approach could not possibly be missed. His gut alone probably kicked up a dust cloud a mile wide, and so the warlord of the Gutstabbers, an orc by the name of Jacques, was well forewarned of Grom's approach, and yet he ordered no actions to be taken against the goblin, figuring probably that if he could humiliate him, which should be easy enough, it is but a goblin after all, no matter how fat he may be, then Grom's sizable warband would undoubtedly join up with him, transforming him from a regional warlord to a power to be felt throughout the World's Edge Mountains. After having waited for what I can only imagine to have been a uncomfortable amount of time, considering the grossly obese nature of his visitor, Jacques eventually roused himself from a brief little nap of boredom. The green-skinned tub of lard finally waddled into view through Jacques' encampment gates. Grom had no doubt grown impressive at this point, but he was still but a goblin, and significantly shorter than the orc warlord. And so, after having laughed at him, pointed fingers, and mocked him for a little bit, the orc warlord stepped forward to make short work out of this gout-ridden beach ball. And there was every reason to believe that he would do so as well. In terms of size, strength, reach, agility, the orc was completely dominant, and quickly buried his cleaver deep into Grom's side. Letting loose a bellow of triumph, the orc attempted to free his weapon. And it didn't work, as it was being sucked deeper into the enormous greenskin's paunch, until Elfbiter came down in a vicious arc, splitting the orc in half, as the cleaver simply slid free from Grom's flesh. The stupefied onlookers could not quite believe what they'd just seen, as the deep cut simply closed, seeming to regrow at horrifying speeds, and their boss crumping to the ground in two neatly sliced halves. Assuming that this simply meant that their boss had been a particularly big, fat weakling liar who had misled them all this time, the rest of the biggins in the tribe stepped forward to kill the now clearly wounded and weakened goblin. And so the previous scene repeated again and again and again and again until there were no more orc biggins left with the balls to commit suicide by goblinoid. But even Grom was starting to get a bit tired. This was the most moving he had done in years, including the walk. For a gentleman of Grom's gravity, traveling God only knows how many kilometers up a mountainside is not exactly easy. And so eventually, after having dispatched all of the other orcs with leadership ambitions, he simply slumped down heavily and felt a weird stirring sensation in his anus. And not the usual kind either, or for the usual reasons. For you see, Grom had not paid particularly close attention to where he was sitting down in the midst of his exhaustions, and so had succeeded in planting himself squarely atop another goblin. Now, this would not be the first or last time that Grom accidentally or intentionally killed someone with his sheer weight. But what was unusual about this was that the goblin wasn't dead, or at the very least so the repeated stirrings inside of Grom's butthole told him. Now, one shudders to think what poor Niblets, which was his name, witnessed whilst buried betwixt Grom's thunderous cheeks. Just imagine what manners of nightmares might spew forth from that most accursed of crevice. Even just a single minute burst of flatulence would unquestionably have peeled the green from poor Niblets' skin. As a side note, by the way, I hold Grom's fetid ass up as a firm and concrete proof that, at least in fantasy, orcs, goblins more precisely, can not be corrupted by Nurgle, as if they could, surely Grom would be disciple number one, as Niblets was now in an unenviable position to attest to. And attest, incidentally, he did, as by some hand-guided miracle, his little spine did not snap beneath the butt. Nor were his goblin eyes evicted from his skull by the pressure. Instead, once Grom could be convinced to shift either through the cheers of the onlookers, his abating exhaustion, or the growing discomfort in his rear, Niblets appeared once more relatively unhurt and sprang back to his feet none the worse for wear. Albeit perhaps with a slightly deranged glint in his eyes. Deeply impressed by the resilience of Buttplug, I mean Niblets, Grom declared him to be a right lucky git, and made him his new banner bearer. No one actually asked Niblets' opinion on this, but considering the potential consequences for refusing, I doubt the idea ever truly crossed his mind. And Niblets' new master, Grom, had now truly shot to stardom. A goblin had killed an orc warlord in single combat, and his entire posse alongside him. The Gutstabbers tribe, of course, immediately prostrated themselves before Grom's enormous belly, and promised him eternal fealty, or until someone bigger came along, obviously. The word spread quickly, and yet further goblin and now orc tribes as well flocked to Grom's banner, which was now faithfully hoisted by Niblets. The banner, incidentally, was named with typical green-skinned creativity as the Lucky Banner. No further commentary required, frankly. And with his growing power, Grom decided it was time to leave the Badlands behind. For whilst they had treated him well enough, there was only so much wealth, honor, glory, and prominence to be had in a place known as the Badlands. And so, like so many greenskins before him, he decided to waffle on over to the World's Edge Mountains and cross them into the fabled softy lands of the Empire, where plunder, booty, and, most importantly of all, foodstuff was plentiful. Of course, there was a minor inconvenience in the way, known as the Dwarven Kingdoms, But Grom was no longer in the habit of fearing anything he could reliably crush to death with his buttocks. And so off waaagh Grom went. Picking a fairly traditional path, the Goblin and Orc hordes poured into Blackfyre Pass, where on their journey westwards they ruined several Dwarven carracks placed to guard the pass. And it was in one of these carracks that Grom committed his greatest act of vandalism, at least if you ask the dwarves, as he came across a colossal representation of the dwarven god Grungi. And Grom, having at this point developed what the orcs would refer to as a healthy sense of self, ordered it to be hewn in to a statue of his own mighty magnificence. Now, having seen examples of greenskin masonry before, I am presuming that what ended up actually appearing from the one statue of Grungi was essentially an enormous sphere covered with dirt, shit, spikes, and perhaps a tiny fortress on top. Lacking artistry aside, however, Grom was no doubt tickled green by the achievement, and henceforth ordered all of his followers to refer to him in appropriate terms, such as, I imagine, your grandiosity, your most tremendous vastness, or your magnificent obesity. And doubtlessly anyone who were so crass as to forget their niceties would see if they could repeat the feat of Niblet. Of course, such desecration could not go unanswered forever, and with one of the largest waaghs in history threatening both their realms and the Empire, whom the dwarves were sworn to aid, the then High King, Bragarek, marched out to meet waaagh Grom in the field. In one of Blackfyre Pass's narrowest segments, he arrayed his serried ranks of dwarves to break the goblinoid hordes upon their shields and axes. Grom was all too happy to oblige the dwarves and their plan, and sent his goblins and orcs storming down the pass to make contact with himself on his wolf chariot at the head of the assault. The first day of violence passed much like the dwarves would have expected it to. The foolish greenskins threw themselves onto their ranks and were splintered like so much driftwood. The only real cause for concern on day one was the monstrous green-skinned creature at the head of the horde. This chubby wrecking ball was clearly some form of malformed troll or squig or something, and it had been making continuous dents in the dwarven lines. Worse yet, even though it had been struck again and again by dwarven axes, its flesh hewn and splintered, it simply kept fighting, seemingly uninjured. Even bolts fired from crossbows simply sank into its portly hide, and whenever the tremendous wolves were slain or the chariot splintered, it simply withdrew, dragging both corpses and chariot along with it, and returned a few hours thereafter, with repairs shoddily made and fresh wolves harnessed. But it was of little concern. Surely the warlord of this invading army would show himself soon enough, and could be killed. With his death, or after sufficient slaughter had been committed, the horde would break like so many others. The two sides settled down for the night, only to resume hostilities early the next day, as another brutal day of fighting continued, as the greenskins simply kept pouring down the pass against the dwarven wall. It was at this point that a uncomfortable thought began sneaking its way into the Dwarven king's mind as the monster reappeared for a second day in a row. Perhaps this was the Warlord. Whenever it appeared, the goblins seemed to redouble their efforts, and it was constantly accompanied by an infuriatingly lucky little goblin wielding a tattered and crude-looking flag. If this creature truly was this invading force's warlord, and upon closer inspection it did bear a certain resemblance to the reports of the profane desecration of Grungni's statue, albeit only vaguely, then that would pose a real problem to the king, as his strategy of killing the leader no longer seemed feasible. The thing, the green-skinned creature, had regenerative powers to rival, nay, surpass that of a troll. And worse yet, its axe, larger than a dwarf in full armor, simply crushed whichever unfortunate Dowie found himself in its path. If the warlord could not be slain, then the only way to win was to break his army. Up and down the line, the dwarves were holding well, and greenskins were being hammered down and sliced apart in their thousands. But despite dusk drawing in on the second day, the king could look down Blackfyre Pass and see nothing but an ocean of greenskins trampling, pushing, and treading over one another in desperation to reach the front. And even with every Dowie bludgeoning 100 goblins before being dragged down, casualties were mounting at a frightening rate, and even Dwarven stamina had its limits. A third day of fighting dawned. Grom once more thundered into the Dwarven lines, and his army followed. The slaughter was near unimaginable. The footing beneath the iron-shod feet of the dwarves had grown so treacherous in a swamp of guts and dark green-skinned blood that it took almost all their concentration to simply keep their balance and their shield up against the pressure of the greenskins. And with the third day growing to a close with no sign of an end to the invading horde, King Bragarek, with a heavy heart, ordered the withdrawal of his army. Defeated in the field, it was an ignoble retreat. The Thanes were ordered to splinter and return to their holds and wage a guerrilla campaign against the invading greenskin. Grom's hordes would be picked apart, slowed down, and hopefully distracted until aid from the Empire could arrive. King Bragarek was of course loath to beg anyone for help, but he saw no other option, and so he sent a message, part warning and part plea, to the court of Dieter IV, Elector Count of Stirland and current ruler of the Empire, with his seat in the capital of Nuln. Ancient treaties from the time of Sigmar Heldenhammer himself of course exist between the dwarves and the Empire, with both sides firmly committed to come to the other's aid in times of trial and invasion. Unfortunately, however, Dieter was a far cry from Sigmar, and not a warrior emperor by any stretch of the imagination. His reaction to receiving the Dwarven king's plea for aid and warning was to pick up his court and move to Altdorf, which was seen as further out of the way of the perceived greenskin invasion path. You can imagine the Dwarven king's reaction to this, particularly as Dieter had only been appointed emperor A few years previously, to the dwarves he was nothing more than an upstart child languishing on the throne surrounded by his dilettantes. This was an insult, pure and simple. More so, it was a callous and cowardly disgrace thrown upon the dwarves and their ancient alliance. And so, in return, King Bragaric ordered his thanes to shut tight their dwarves and hold their carracks fast. No further efforts would be made to slow Grom the Paunch's advance. No further guerrilla actions, no further endangering of Dawi lives. They would batten down the hatches and wait for the storm to pass, regardless of any treaty. Since the Empire was unwilling to hold up their end after all, there was no reason for Bragaric to hold up his any further than he already had. For the dwarves, this proved to be a successful strategy. The greenskins had never been the most driven or effective of besiegers after all, and now facing off against proper large-scale carracks rather than border fortresses, they couldn't really get anywhere. And soon the scattered smaller outposts, the mountain farms and breweries had all been raided 3 times over, with goblins bickering in the ruins for the last forgotten scraps. Clearly, the Dwarven kingdoms would not be broken open so easily, and frankly, there was no reason to try either, as the path towards the Promised Land now was wide open. And whilst the horde had certainly been thinned by the battle in Blackfyre Pass, the tale of Grom's success, his defeat of a dwarven army, and him now ravaging the mountain lands had spread wide and far behind his lines, as hundreds of further tribes of orcs and goblins streamed to his banner year by year. Until the unstoppable tidal wave flooded in to Stirland and Talabecland. The Empire's armies mobilized to meet the invader, but with no central governing authority actually giving a shit about the invasion, the only thing the local counts, dukes, and electors could do was mobilize their personal retinues, create militia forces, and march out to meet the innumerable forces of the green-skinned marauders. Hopelessly outnumbered, and not having the benefit of Blackfyre Pass's restrictive geography, these smaller, scattered, unorganized and undirected armies were simply overrun and drowned beneath Grom's numbers. Those leaders in the Empire who had some wits behind them quickly began withdrawing from the countryside into their keeps, their fortresses, and their walled cities, hoping to emulate the successful strategy of the dwarves. This turned out to be, again, a wise maneuver, as Grom had developed a distinct distaste for siege warfare in the mountains against the dwarves. Whenever the horde, now scattered across a truly enormous tract of the Empire, came across a fortified settlement, they would make a few half-hearted attempts here and there. If successful, the horde would descend in its full fury and crush the defenders. Wherever they could hold out against the initial few waves, the city, the village, the fortress was usually simply bypassed. The countryside around it burned to a crisp, and everything edible or of value carried off with the hordes. Tragically for the then capital of the Empire, Data had been a connoisseur of the finer arts, and had found the huge walls of Newlyn and its countless bastions to be a distraction, a decidedly non-aesthetic flourish, and had many of them replaced with marbled sculptures and gloriously crafted yet ineffective battlements, so that when Grom arrived outside the walls, he found it surprisingly brittle and thoroughly tempting. Nuln would remain a capital, all right, but a capital of the Goblin rather than the Empire, as Grom sat squatting in the Emperor's golden palace as he ordered his bosses to spread out across the Empire and ravage its riches and bring its food to him. Even Grom was hard-pressed to devour the tons upon tons of grains, of meat, and occasionally of plump little humans brought before him, as little, if any, effective resistance could be mounted against him, and once more his army grew, as every tribe of goblins and orcs within the Empire began flooding forth from the forests and the dark places to join the now legendary waaagh of Grom the Paunch. It seemed to be the end of Sigmar's dream, yet there was still one bright shining little light found in the Reichlands and in Altdorf. Not Dieter, of course, no, his cousin, Prince Wilhelm. He had managed to establish a relatively effective resistance made up of militia and mounted knights and cavalry forces. He could not hope to stand up to Grom's actual army, but as it was scattered across the enormous vast tracts of the Empire, looting, pillaging, burning, and besieging, now that they had plenty of time to do so, Wilhelm realized that he could hit individual smaller warbands, crashing into them with knights and mounted skirmishers, shattering them apart, and then withdrawing to the safety of a chain of fortified cities and fortresses that were popping up all around Reichland on Prince Wilhelm's initiative. With this highly mobile force and continued blockhouses to withdraw to, he was able to keep the Reichlands mostly greenskin free, which in turn allowed it to be practically the only state to keep food production up and running. With the rest of the Empire subsumed in greenskins, any attempt at sowing, ploughing, or harvesting was utterly futile, as the goblins would simply ravage the countryside again, searching for yet more food. And had Grom had it his way, the Empire would have been turned into a huge green-skinned nation, as he was more than happy to simply waddle about in the ruins of Nuln, receiving tithe and tribute aplenty. He had built himself enormous treasuries, but his war bosses, his orcs, were continuously harassing and haranguing him to go out and find something else to loot. Finally, as, well, frankly, there wasn't a whole lot of actual fighting to be had, and what little existed against Prince Wilhelm's skirmishers was hardly fighting. Getting sniped at by mounted humies who would run away the moment the orcs shouted at them was hardly all that much fun. Not that Grom cared, of course. He was a goblin, not an orc, but eventually the salvation of the Empire arrived in the most unusual of forms. One of Grom's shamans, a favoured one from the olden days, had entered into a mysterious trance and claimed to have communed with the green-skinned twin deities of Gork and Mork, who said that the orcs were right. They demanded fresh plunder, fresh loot, and fresh battles. Grom would have to get off his enormous arse and actually go crump something. And if he didn't, well, a curse of anorexia would probably solve all these problems. Oh yes, Grom got very energetic very quickly, and specifically his shaman had told him that his destiny lay across the sea. Right, well that was weird. Not a whole lot of greenskins had crossed the ocean before, and frankly they had no idea how to really... The idea of building boats was, well, quite alien to them, but, well, they had seen boats before, so... How difficult could it be to replicate? You take wood, you put wood together, and you place wood on water. If wood doesn't sink, boat. Easy peasy, really. Now, there was one problem, and that was that there wasn't enough water to put the wood on. Grom was nowhere near the coast, and so he had to make all due haste northwards towards the coast. He was in such a hurry, in fact, that when his chariot was destroyed by a stray cannonball, he ordered his army to invade the largest city nearby, which just so happened to be Middenheim, tear the roof of the largest building they could find, which happened to be the temple to Ulrich of the White Wolf, and then they left again, leaving the city mostly fine. Yeah, except for the temple, of course. Finally reaching the coast of Nordland, Grom ordered the construction of a mighty fleet. Many question marks were raised as to what exactly a fleet was, but after sufficient encouragement and beatings, wood was being chopped down in apocalyptic quantities, leaving much of Nordland completely barren even to this day. The fleet created was... well, again, wood on water, and hey, it did float, therefore it plainly fit the description of fleet. It did take many months to actually complete it, but when finally done, Grom simply got aboard the fleet and waited for wind and tide to carry it wherever he was supposed to go for his grand and glorious destiny. The only force capable of contending this navy was the Imperial Navy, which was at the time headed by Admiral von Kronitz. Not von, by the way, remember, Reichsspiel is not German. Who was hesitant to do anything about this, frankly. And it's hard to blame him. Here he is, with actual warships, with sailors and ships and sails and a knowledge of currents and tides and winds and etc. And opposite him is a forest on water. Literally the entire timber produce of his entire state. Just tossed into the river with a few sails and treadwheels and gunwales mounted onto it. Even if he was to engage it, what was his objective? What was he going to sink? And if he was going to sink something, which one of the crudely fashioned together mounds of wood was he supposed to aim for? Figuring instead that the goblins, probably rather amateurish seamanship would do a great deal of his duty for him, the Admiral simply retreated before the encroaching fleet of sorts, until finally reaching the mouth of the river Reich and the location of the imperial city of Marienburg, which was still at the time an imperial city. Incidentally, Dieter IV was the one who sold that city to its burgomaster, thereby granting it its independence. But for now, it was still an imperial city, and a vast, wealthy, and powerful one. Admiral Kronitz needed to make a stand. He needed to at least make a show of an attempt at stopping the encroaching green-skinned navy, and so he deployed his vessels as best he could and braced for the storm. A mighty sea battle continued, the Imperials having a clear-cut advantage in terms of gunnery, seamanship, maneuverability, and fighting ability on the swaying decks of their ships. But for every green-skinned vessel sent to the bottom of the Reich, another 12 took its place, until the Imperial Armada was so completely and utterly intermingled and surrounded by green-skinned ships that they could practically walk to shore dry-shoed. It didn't work out particularly well. Well over half of the Imperial Navy was simply crushed beneath the unimaginable weight of the green-skinned flotilla. Yes, flotilla is a much better word than fleet now that I come to think about it. The remnants attempted to escape and flee, to disengage and beach their ships on the shore to escape into Marienburg. The city itself was now left practically defenseless, as its seaside walls could not hope to stop the flotilla. Fortunately, finally, Manan, the god of the sea and the ocean, decided to intervene, and a mighty storm swept through the green-skinned flotilla, wrecking many ships and sending the rest hurtling over the horizon into the great ocean, where many more ships would capsize and sink, be splintered apart, crushed, or become the victims of enormous sea monsters. Hundreds upon hundreds of vessels would eventually be found crushed and splintered on the shores of Bretonia, who would have to fight off small goblin war bands for weeks and months thereafter. But Grom's own ship and the heart of his armada, 40 days later, arrived in Ulthuan. Which should have been impossible. The elven city is protected by countless magical barriers, by fog, by reefs, by sea monsters, by strange, unnerving spells that make any attempt at navigation completely pointless, and I guess there lies the explanation. Yes, you cannot navigate your way to Ulthuan, but you can happen upon it through sheer dumb luck. And hey, Niblet was still alive, and alongside and carrying Grom's lucky banner. And from Grom's point of view, this strange new land must obviously have been the objective that his gods had sent him out to conquer. Where it was, he did not know. Who owned it? He did not care. He would lead his horde, diminished though it might now be, in its destruction, and find himself a new place to sit perched atop another mountain of treasure and food. Sadly, much of his previous riches had disappeared beneath the waves, including his most glorious chariot to date. A true tragedy, but luckily the new land was also plentiful in building material, as these cities were rarely walled or guarded at all. There were a few slender watchtowers here and there, but nothing to rival the walled cities of the Empire. Clearly, the local pansies, with their strange shiny armor and weird spiky ears, hadn't thought anyone could just arrive from the sea like this. Stupid elves. And so he set about ravaging the countryside yet again. To the goblins, this was business as usual, and for the orcs, those who had survived, this was what they'd always been asking for. Finally, some more crumpets to be had. For the elves, this was everything besides business as usual. There was a reason why the sparsely populated coast of Ivres was not particularly well fortified, because they never expected to really be invaded from that direction, and certainly not by an enormous fleet of orcs and goblins. Their primary defenses were the magic wards, and even if the wards hadn't been able to stop them, they should have decimated the invaders and given their fleet plenty of forewarning to intercept them, and yet none of that had happened. Desperately, they mobilized what garrisons they could to try and stem the tide of the invaders. Skirmishing cavalry engaged the hordes of warbands wherever they could, but now, having been solidified in a large horde rather than the multitude of smaller groupings in the Empire, they found it exceedingly difficult to find targets that wouldn't in turn see them surrounded by the countless greenskins swelling up around them. They defended strategic crossings of rivers, they defended bridges, and they tried to fight the goblins wherever they could find a choke point where they could stand for a period and then fall back without being crushed. But the numbers of such places available to them fell drastically and swiftly. Worse yet, the various watchstones, the menhirs surrounding Ulthuan, were being destroyed seemingly for just funsies by the invader. This was seen by the elves as a ridiculous action. Did the invader not see that the destruction of these ancient artifacts surrounded by magical energy would only make things worse? Could they not feel the swirls of chaos and the immaterium beings drained by them? Could they not see that this was a beneficial enchantment? Well, no, as it turned out. Although, they weren't completely clueless about the Watchstones. Oh, no, far from it. In fact, Grom's favoured shaman by the name of Blacktooth had figured out that they were indeed magical, and he'd also figured out that they were in fact siphoning off magical power. But as far as he was concerned, all that meant were that they were enormous batteries, whose destructions meant that he could siphon all of that power into himself. Unsurprisingly, he felt very, very strongly that Grom should tear down as many of them as he possibly could, as he headed towards the next large coalition of magic, which just so happened to be Tor Ivres. This was something quite different than the small settlements, the villages, and the watchtowers that the invaders had been ravaging so far. The majestic city was home to a large, high-elf garrison, and its spires could spot the approaching horde from miles away. The arrogant garrison commander figured that he could easily stomp out a handful of greenskins without needing to besmirch the beautiful white walls of a city, and so marched out to give battle to the invading army. And for a time, the garrison commander appeared to be correct. Grom's force had been, again, much reduced by his overseas voyage, and it had been whittled away and yet further, fighting across Ulthuan to this point. And goblins were hardly a match for the citizen militia of Ulthuan. Their spears flashed in the dawning day as they stabbed and struck down goblins with callous ease. Only Grom was able to do any real damage to the serried ranks of spearmen, presenting a perfect phalanx to the green horde. And the numbers were simply no longer with Grom. He had broken the dwarves of Blackfyre Pass by simply drowning them in bodies, in the guts and blood of his goblin hordes. And for all of Grom's personal prowess, riding a chariot built from the smashed-through veins of elven villas and wielding his axe, now appropriately named Elf Biter, to cut down dozens of the dainty little defenders, his army was dwindling rapidly. But Grom had not fought his way all across the old world and to Ulthuan without picking up a trick or two. And the complacent elves soon found themselves being attacked from the flanks and rears by wolf rider cavalry. After more than a month spent in the holds of ships, the wolves had gotten creative with their own diets, and both the numbers of riders and mounts had shrunk drastically. But those that remained was the hard-core nucleus of the best and, most ferocious of Grom's elite mobile striking force. And beneath their fangs and fur, the elves quickly began to buckle, fleeing backwards towards Tor Ivres over the now seemingly immeasurable distance, being hounded and torn down every step of the way. Only slivers of the once glorious host managed to reach the walls and get back in through the gates before Grom hammered into it. Despite their delicate appearance, however, the walls of Tor Ivres were still solid. Falling back for his siege machines, constructed again from the desecrated ruins of elven villages, Grom ordered the bombardment to begin, and aided with the now soon to bursting level powerful magics of Blacktooth, the delicate walls swiftly began to crumble and shake and break, until the horde swept into the city. The now hopelessly outnumbered defenders did what they could to defend the narrow streets, and did so with some success as well, but narrow streets. That was the preferred battleground for Grom and his chariot, which would simply run right over phalanx after phalanx of elven militia, even as Blacktooth himself headed towards the grand tower at the center of Tor Ivres to destroy the watchstone that rested within. With its destruction, Ulthuan itself would begin to tear the city apart, as the entire island was likely to sink back beneath the waves with the magical power unleashed. Victory and complete destruction was mere minutes away when Blacktooth suddenly and unexpectedly lost his head. Not figuratively, quite literally, as an elven blade passed through his neck and a blur of half-seen feathers darted past his wyvern and down towards the battlefield below. Mounted atop this griffin sat Eltharion, perhaps the second greatest elf to have ever lived. His army had only recently returned from a relatively successful invasion of Nagorond, a feat itself thought near impossible until he had simply gone and done it. And now he struck down amongst the invading greenskin hordes like a thunderbolt from a clear sky, impaling goblins by the dozens on his spear, beheading others by the sword, as his griffin slaughtered scores more. But even more devastating was the army he had brought. Grom's horde had barely prevailed against the citizen militia of Tor Ivres. Now, descending upon it was the battle-hardened, well-ordered and focused army of Eltharion, veterans of a cruel and merciless war against their hated cousins, the Dark Elves. No pampered city dwellers, these. These were soldiers to rival the skill and power of any army in the old world, and it had just hit Grom's much depleted force. And for the first time in its long history, Grom's army broke and scattered, even as the Pouch himself wheeled through groups of his own greenskins to try and demonstrate the fate of those who fled. The rout could not be stopped, until Grom himself, seeing the slaughter and the shiny pointy-eared on the giant bird, decided that for once discretion was probably the better part of valor, and disappeared into the hinterlands of the elven Isle of Ulthuan, never to be seen again, but also never to be killed either. Perhaps he simply perished from hunger or harsh weather, or was killed by some ranging warband of elves who never bothered to check their quarry. Or perhaps he found some way to escape. At least the goblins of the old world are thoroughly convinced that he did, and one day soon, he will return to them and lead another mighty warg to crush the civilized races once more beneath his green-skinned girth. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.